Hi, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our program with Ron Duncan Hart. Dr. Ron Duncan Hart. We will spend our time together over these two sessions exploring crypto Jews, the long journey. I'm eager to learn with Dr. Hart as we journey from the very dark times in Jewish history, the centuries of the Inquisition and Jewish expulsions, to the later 20th and 21st centuries, a time when individuals and families are able, if they choose to reclaim the identity of being Jewish. It is a distinctive history that continues to unfold today, leading to unique identities and communities. I look forward to diving into this journey with Dr. Hart. Please note that we will be facilitating questions at the end of the lecture. Click on the Q&A button to send us your questions. Thank you all for joining us. And with that, I would like to welcome Elaine Amir, the Haberman Institute Board President, to introduce our speaker. Hi, Elaine.
Hi, Matt. Nice to see everybody. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Crypto Jews, The Long Journey, a lecture that has drawn the interest of over 700 people from all over the U.S. and several countries abroad. I'm Elaine Amir, president of the Haberman Institute Board of Directors, and I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Ron Duncan Hart. Of course, I'm first going to take the opportunity to remind you that our mission is to provide high-quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. And that's just what we're going to happen tonight. I also take this moment to thank you, so many of you who have helped to support our programs, especially during this past year and a half. You know that although nearly all of our programs are offered free of charge, it's not free for us to create and deliver them. If you like our program tonight, for example, consider becoming a friend of the Haberman Institute for $120. Your gift entitles you to certain benefits, but we think the greatest gift we can offer in return is the continuation of insightful scholarly programs. I appreciate the opportunity tonight to welcome personally Dr. Ron Duncan Hart, whom I met nearly 2 years ago, on a Rhodes Scholar trip to learn about the crypto Jews of New Mexico. I had heard a story many years ago about a young man from Brooklyn who got tired of being in a community of so many Jews. So he went as far away as he could. He escaped to New Mexico. He set himself up in Santa Fe, and he met a young woman of interest, and he asked her out, and he went to pick her up at her home on a Friday night. She came to the door, and then she said suddenly, "Oops, I forgot," and she went back and opened a cupboard, lowered her head, mumbled a few words, waved her arms over her eyes, turned around to look as if she were checking to see if anybody had noticed what she was doing, closed the cupboard, and then said to him, "Okay, let's go, I'm ready." And he said, what were you doing?" She said, "I don't really know, but my grandmother has always done it, my mother has always done it, and I'm told that I must follow this tradition." And so when I heard that there was a Rhodes Scholar trip to learn about the crypto Jews of New Mexico, I jumped on it. And then I got the treat of the whole event, hearing Dr. Ron Duncan Hart speak about the history of the crypto Jews in this fascinating community. And I'm so happy that he's here with us tonight. Ron Duncan Hart is a cultural anthropologist who earned his PhD at Indiana University and then did postdoctoral work in Jewish studies at the University of Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. He's the former president of the Jewish Federation of New Mexico, and he's received awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Science Foundation, Ford Foundation. I'm not going to go on for his whole portfolio because we'll be here forever, but also the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, among others. And I think it was in his spare time that he served a number of years as editor of Halapid, the Journal of the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies. Ron is the author of several books on religion, cultural history, and social change, including Fractured Faiths, Spanish Judaism, the Inquisition, and New World Identities. He served as the historical consultant for the exhibit of the same name at the New Mexico History Museum in Santa Fe. Fractured Faiths won the gold medal for the best book on a religious topic in 2018. As Matt noted, Dr. Hart will engage in a Q&A session at the end of his talk. Please send your questions to the Q&A moderator. And with that, the Zoom box is yours, Ron. Welcome. Great to see you again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here today as a part of this program of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. And I would like to thank Executive Director Matthew Silverman and Board President Elaine Amir for this invitation. And I'd also like to thank Program Director Becky Levy for her collaboration and helping make these arrangements. So before we begin to talk, I'd like to show something. Just a moment. So you might ask how I became involved with this. This is the Palacio de la Inquisición, the Palace of the Inquisition in Cartagena, Colombia. And this is where I was first introduced to the issue of hidden Jews in the Americas. I lived and worked in Colombia for many years, and this is in Cartagena on the coast. And in the 1600s, there was a population of hidden Jews in this city. And I visited this many years ago. And one of the things, of course, that I encountered, we will look, this is the chamber where the inquisitors sat at the front, asking the people who had been arrested about their practices. And we'll come back to look at this a little bit later. So one of the things that we're going to do, I would also like to mention, to recognize at this point, that my wife and research associate, Gloria Avella-Balin, accompanied me and was a part of gathering the information over many years, doing research in the archive of the Inquisition in Madrid and other places. And I appreciate her collaboration in this. Today, we are going to talk about the start of the crypto-Jewish experience in Spain and how it arrived to the Americas. And next week, we'll look in more in depth about Mexico and New Mexico itself and how it survived, how the practices of crypto-Judaism survived on the edges of the Spanish Empire, even into the 20th century here in the American Southwest. The descendants of crypto-Jews today have lived a culture of hiding within a Catholic context for centuries, during which they've developed a unique culture of obfuscating, and David Gitlitz says even of deceit, because you had to hide, you had to protect this identity. After hundreds of years of separation from their Jewish cousins in Spain, the people who are now Sephardic Jews, who lived largely were living in North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, but now mostly in Israel or in Latin America, the people who still practice openly as Jews are quite different from their cousins, the crypto-Jews, who've lived all this time in a Catholic context adapting to different kinds of cultural demands. So we're going to look a little bit at these differences. As I mentioned, today we'll be looking primarily at the experience in Spain itself and the arrival to the Americas. And this is more the historical part. As we get in next week, we'll get in more into the information about people's lives more recently. And that, in a sense, is a little bit more like the anthropological part. So I'd like to look at one other thing here. And these are some of the people that here we go, I think. Okay, these are some of the people with whom I have worked over the years. On the top level, Rabbi Jordi Gendra on the top left and Rabbi Juan Mejia on the top right have made their returns to Judaism and become rabbis. Sonia Loya, who's in the middle on the top, and the others are all activists who have been involved in the return to Jewish practice movement, and we will be seeing more about them next week. So we're talking about lives of real people, and these are people who have their stories to tell, and I will try my best to represent those stories as best I can. Okay, so who are the conversos, the crypto-Jewish people who have returned to Jewish practice today? There are different terms for the experiences of their ancestors, and just to clarify terms, let me mention this. Converso is the most general term that we'll be using, and it's simply the Spanish word for someone who converts. It's a generic term. We don't know, when we say a person is a converso, we know they converted. We don't know if they feigned conversion and are still acting as a crypto-Jew, or whether they converted and actually became Christians. So that's the general term. Anosim is another term that you will see, which is the Hebrew word for someone who was forced. And it refers to people who were coerced to convert, or were forcibly converted against their will. So the anosim is another nuance of this experience that we'll be looking at. And then when we talk about crypto-Jews, we're talking about people who continued to live and identify personally as Jewish, even though they continued to live in Spanish territories where it was illegal to be Jewish. The Edict of Expulsion states very clearly that any Jew that was in a Spanish territory was under the threat of the death penalty. So converso Jew was a person who made that rather demanding choice. Maimonides, who experienced the pressure to convert in his own life, later wrote a treatise on feigned conversion. And he argues that a Jew should do what they have to do to save their life when they're in a threatening situation, even converting. Now, he was talking about converting to Islam, but it also became relevant as Christianity began imposing pressure on Jews to convert. But he said, it's all right to convert if you need to, but you need to leave the situation as soon as you can to go back to a situation where you can live openly as a practicing Jew. Although anti-Jewishness has existed, did exist from the beginning of Christianity, a dramatic escalation of anti-Jewishness and anti-Judaism started just before 1100 in Europe. And that's going to be our starting point, that we'll look to see how this developed in the European context. It went on rather dramatically up to the expulsion from Spain in 1492, which essentially eliminated most of Jewish life in Western Europe. And Jews at that point largely eradicated from Western Europe, found their homes in Eastern Europe, and we'll see in the case of crypto-Jews, or going into the Muslim countries, such as Morocco, the Ottoman Empire, and so on. And with the crypto-Jews, we'll see that many of them decided to come to the Americas to try to escape that process. There are three dates. Let me do the history part here just a minute, so that you can kind of see the turning point that happened just at 1100. At 1088, the Christian forces defeated the Muslims. The Muslims had ruled Spain for almost 800 years, by 1492. But by 1100, they had been there 400 years. And they'd controlled really most of Spain at that point. In 1088, the Christian forces, who were organized and were pushing back against the Muslims, defeated the Muslim forces in central Spain and took the key city of Toledo, which had a significant Jewish population, by the way. 2 years later, in 1090, the Almoravids, a Moroccan fundamentalist Islamic group, invaded Spain to take over and reinforce Muslim rule in the southern part of the country, which still controlled the most of the south, including the cities of Cordoba, Seville, and Granada. So that was in 1090. The next Christian response to that came 5 years later, 1095, when Pope Urban II made the call for the first crusade to go to Jerusalem to drive out the Muslims and to free the Holy Land for Christianity. At the same time, these crusades really had a two-pronged approach, because there were Muslims in Spain, of course. So this encouraged also the Christian forces fighting in Spain, as well as the ones going to the Holy Land. Now, as the Crusaders were going down the Rhine Valley eastward, going toward Jerusalem, the argument came up, or the idea came up, that there are not only infidels in Jerusalem, there are infidels in the Rhine Valley, referring to the Jewish populations. So we have the first major violent attacks on Jewish communities that are becoming a part of this militant church. And several towns were attacked, hundreds, if not thousands, were killed in the process. So we began to see the being Jewish in Europe is taking a different turn here as we start the 1100s. Another thing that's happening in this process is, in Spain, the fusion of Spanish identity and Christianity was becoming stronger. And eventually the expression developed, hablo cristiano, which is Spanish for I speak Christian. And it's referring to the Spanish language, or Castellano basically, as being the Christian language. You can still hear this phrase today in Latin America, in rural areas, where people still refer to the language they speak as Cristiano. So there's this fusion between being Spanish and being Christian. Over the next couple of hundred years, the situation continues to deteriorate for Jews. And by the time we get to the 1300s, there are major, major changes. And I would like to go back and look just a minute to show you some of the things that we find here. Okay, in Spain, these are settlements that had major Jewish settlements. You can see they were scattered around all over Spain. Jews have been in Spain for 1,500 years. So there'd been a long time of settlement there. The attacks that began in 1300s started in Seville in the south. And the person who really started this was a church member there called Ferran Martinez. He was anti-Jewish, and he incited mob violence to destroy synagogues, attack Jewish neighborhoods, and in the process, thousands were killed. Now, to understand, to keep the right perspective on this, Seville was essentially the New York of Spain at that time. It had the largest Jewish population, the wealthiest Jewish population. So you can see that attacking the Jewish population of Seville and destroying synagogues was a drastic step. As this started in Seville, which is in the south, it began to spread across central and northern Spain, and Jewish communities in other cities were also destroyed. For example, the cities of Gerona in the north and Barcelona, the Jewish communities were totally destroyed in 1391, never to have Jews again until recent decades. The Jane Gerber, who has written the classic definitive study on Jews in Spain, estimates that in these attacks in 1391, that 100,000 people were killed. 100,000 were killed. 100,000 were forced to convert, and we're going to see more about that in a minute. And another 100,000 perhaps fled Spain. Now, Spain had had the largest Jewish population in Europe up to this point. Maybe 500,000 people. We don't know the exact numbers. There's no exact census. But you can see a major part of that population was either killed, converted, or fled at this point. The person who was leading these attacks on the Jewish community in the rest of Spain was a Dominican priest whose name was Vicente Ferrer, and he led evangelical campaigns, going from town to town throughout Spain, preaching against the Jews. Now, what we're seeing here, he was Jews were actually forced to come in to hear his sermons. And I don't know if you can pick it out, but in the front center here, there is a man holding a Torah scroll, which shows very clearly this is a Jewish crowd, and Vicente Ferrer is preaching to them. His campaigns from 1390 up to 1419, a 30-year period, continued to be vehemently anti-Jewish. He is credited with having forced the conversions of 25,000 Jews through his sermons, and he was made a saint for that. After his sermons, it was quite common that the Christians who had heard the sermons were so riled up and so angry against the Jews that they literally would go to the Jewish quarters and attack the people there. Chains, the descriptions of the time say chains, clubs, knives, people were killed, synagogues damaged, businesses destroyed, and so on. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the church always refused to claim responsibility, even though it was the Dominican priest doing this preaching. They always claimed it was criminal elements who got out of hand and who did these things. So that's the atmosphere that we're living in 1391. And to a lesser extent, it continued over the next 30 years. One of the cases that's important that I would like to call to your attention is a rabbi from Burgos, Solomon Halevi, that we're seeing here, a Talmudic scholar, highly respected for his knowledge. But if you can see just under the picture of him here, his name is actually Pablo Santamaria. So what happened was that in the riots of 1391, Solomon Halevi converted, a rabbi who converted. Not only he converted, but his two brothers, his 5 children, his sister, all converted with him. The one person who did not convert in this family was his wife. And of course, after he converted, he actually joined the church and became a priest, which happened on more occasions than you can imagine. He went to the University of Paris, earned a doctorate in theology, Catholic theology. He came back to Burgos and was named the archbishop. Now, after being named the archbishop, the king passed away. His son was too young, and now Archbishop Pablo Santamaria was named the regent and literally ruled for the next several years until the younger son could take over as king. He developed such power within the church and with the Spanish world that he actually had aspirations to become pope. It didn't happen, but that's the level that he worked at. So this is probably the most extreme example we have of the converts, but you can see the kind of thing that could happen. 3 of his sons became priests. They were largely in the area of Plasencia, which is a little bit further south in Spain. And Roger Martinez Davila has done some interesting research on that family, and he found that the 3 sons who were the priests seemed to have protected crypto-Jews under their jurisdiction, which suggests they were aware of their Jewish background and in some ways were respecting it in that sense. The pressure on the Jews to convert continued during this time, and particularly under the Pope Benedict XIII. Jews were moved into ghettos. They had not been ghettoized before. So they were literally closed into ghettos to separate them from the Christian population. Jewish books were confiscated. Only one synagogue was allowed per city, per town. And so the pressure on Jews was becoming significant. Now, this led to consequences. And one of them is the decline in the Jewish population that is going on. From when we start here in the 1300s, there were an estimated still maybe 400,000 Jews in Spain. And you can see how this drops regularly over the next couple of centuries. By the time we get down to 1492, of course, there are no Jews left in Spain. They're expelled. You either had to convert or leave. So we go from, with a matter of a couple of hundred years, from 400,000, a major Jewish population, down to 0. In 1492, then we have the Edict of Expulsion, which we can see here. And the Edict of Expulsion basically says that all Jews and Jewishes are to be expelled from Spain and from any of the territories of Spain. They'd not yet discovered the Americas, but this immediately began to apply to the Americas. And it also says that on penalty of death, if any Jew sets foot in Spanish territory. Now, that last part was difficult to enforce all the time, but it was a penalty that was constantly hanging over the heads of people. There were 13 or 14 copies of this Edict of Expulsion made. They were posted in the major cities around Spain, and this was done on March 31st, 1492. Jews were given until July 31st to leave the country, to dispose of their goods, leave the country. They could not take gold with them or wealth. They were allowed basically to leave with what they could carry. So this was a traumatic event for the Jewish communities, and people were forced to choose. Were you going to stay and convert, or were you going to leave everything that you had known, your language, your house, your businesses, your properties, and go to a foreign land to start again? I'd like to to go with you through the case of these two men, Isaac Abravanel and Abraham Senior. These were two of the most important Jewish advisors for Queen Isabella. So Ferdinand and Isabella were the king and the queen at the point. She was the Queen of Castile. They were the leading tax collectors in Castile and advisors to the queen. So when the Edict of Expulsion was given in 1492, the two of them went to the queen and appealed to her, don't do this, don't expel the Jews from our land. And they had actually made a sizable collection of wealth from the Jewish community. Remember, people couldn't take gold with them. They couldn't take wealth out of the country. So they offered this to the king and the queen. And but apparently the story goes that in that process, the director of the Inquisition, Tomás Torquemada, came into the chamber and denounced what was going on and said, this is the problem with the Jews. We have to expel the Jews because of their influence in this country. As we know the story, the king and queen did not accept to rescind the edict. It stayed in place. Jews were expelled. Abraham Senior, Isaac Abravanel, was able to negotiate a short extension of like a couple of days to be added to the date of the expulsion, which moved it up to August the 2nd, which happened to be the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. And it's become one of the dates that is so important in this calendar. The other thing that begins to happen here, now the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition had actually been established before the expulsion, but it could only arrest people who were conversos. The Inquisition could not arrest Jews. I mean, if you had always kept your identity as a Jew, you couldn't be arrested by the Inquisition. But they focused on conversos, or crypto Jews. They were trying to find people who were still practicing Jewish practices in secret. What we're seeing here is Goya's representation of the public trials that would be held by the Inquisition. It was called an auto de fe. It was an act of faith. And the people who were accused of Judaizing or breaking other norms of the church would be brought in before these stadium-sized public events. And the inquisitors would be sitting at the front. They would be in the top center of the image that we're seeing here. And the sentences of each of the people would be read out. Now, the Inquisition in Spain, something important to know about it. The Spanish Inquisition was actually run by the Spanish crown. It was set up by the Spanish crown. It was not a church Inquisition. It was a Spanish crown institution. But the Spanish crown asked the Dominicans to run the Inquisition for them. So the Dominicans were the inquisitors. They made the decisions. They gave the sentences. Once a person was sentenced, whatever their fate was, they were turned over to the secular authorities, to the crown authorities, who actually carried out the sentence. So the church would always say, we never burned anyone at the stake. And technically that's true. They would pass the sentences, but the person, the people doing the burning at the stake were actually crown officials, in a sense, the sheriff of the location. The Inquisition made a tremendous impact early on in these early years. It was actually established in 1480. And by 1530, 50 years later, the Inquisition had arrested something between 10 and 20,000 people for Judaizing. 2,000 of those had been burned at the stake. So look at the numbers. if we don't know exactly how many conversos there were in Spain at this point, but maybe 80,000 or so. Top number, I think most people would say, would be maybe 100,000, but we're probably in the 75 to 80,000 range. If 10 to 20,000 were being arrested for Judaizing, we're talking about arresting maybe 1 out of every 4 or 5 conversos who had stayed in Spain. And so if you were a converso and you were seeing these numbers being arrested by the Inquisition, and of those being arrested, then a very high number were also being condemned to be burned at the stake. I've also thought about this. If I had been in that setting, I would have rethought my decision to stay in Spain. And in fact, what happened was that converso families began leaving Spain in huge numbers. One other figure we need to see here is, this is Torquemada, Tomas Torquemada, who was the leader of the Inquisition at this point, and was set these really severe standards that we've been looking at. So what happened with the people is the converso families were there began leaving in large numbers. And by the time we get to 1600, the thing that happens is that there were almost no arrests by the Inquisition of crypto Jews at that point. So 100 years after the expulsion, by 1600, the number of arrests by the Inquisition goes down to almost nothing. There's still a few, but very few. So so what's happening here is that we begin to get changes. Now, the Inquisition was looking at this point more at Protestants than they were at Jews, because Protestants after 1517 with Martin Luther had become a threat. And I often mention to my Protestant friends, I'm sorry for the fact that you had to take on the Inquisition at that point, but it took some of the heat off of us, you know. So one of the other things that was so dramatic in this process, not only did the Jewish, the converso populations by and large leave Spain, but the eradication of the Jewish presence became so thorough that after Jews had lived in Spain for 1,500 years, there had been synagogues, there were cemeteries. All of that is gone. There are still some synagogues today that still exist as churches, and we'll look at that a little bit later. But for example, the cemeteries are all gone. There are no Jewish cemeteries in Spain. So this is such a dramatic example of how Spain was eradicating the Jewish presence. The churches, some synagogues buildings were converted into church buildings, and quite often, those church buildings are called Sangre de Cristo Church, the blood of Christ. So the name of the church is given again, if it was a former synagogue, in a sense, accusing Jews of what had happened. Okay, so what happened to the people who were still practicing Judaism at this point? What survived for crypto Jews? The synagogues, if you were still in Spain or a Spanish territory somewhere, there were no synagogues, no rabbis, no Jewish schools, no Torah scrolls, no Talmuds, all the books were gone. So what's left was basically domestic Jewish practice. And that's in the role of the women in the house. Women could keep a kosher house. Women could train the children in Jewish identity and Jewish teachings. They could light candles on Friday night. They could observe Shabbat, which was one of the common practices. Holidays could be observed. Fasts could be observed. All of that was observed within the domestic sphere. basically controlled by women. And this is an important point because you'll see later, even today, women in the return to Judaism, women have a very important role because of what has traditionally been that practice. So as the conversos and the crypto-Jews disappeared from Spain, that doesn't mean they disappeared altogether from the Iberian Peninsula. Basically, they survived in Portugal. And there's an interesting story. We won't go into all the details on that. But many tens of thousands of Jews leaving Spain in 1492 went into Portugal because it was the neighboring kingdom. It was right there. And but the Spanish kings pressured the Portuguese king to do the same thing, to expel the Jews. But interestingly enough, the Portuguese king didn't really want to expel Jews. So he did a kind of ruse. In 1497, he wrote an edict of expulsion and said that Jews had a year to leave. But in the meantime, when the deadline came up in 1498, he simply issued an edict saying all Jews in the Kingdom of Portugal are now Christians. Declare them Christians. And now these are true Anisim. These are people who did not choose to be Christian. They were simply legally declared Christians. So you have, but Portugal didn't have the Inquisition. And the other thing that's interesting here is the king in the edict said that there would not be an Inquisition in Portugal for another 40 years or 2 generations. So his logic was that would give people time to learn to be Christian. Well, what happened was people with Jewish practice continued their Jewish practices. This is where the largest body of crypto-Jews existed. And they lived without being bothered, really, for the next 40 years. After the Inquisition was established in Portugal, we began to see an out-migration of these Portuguese crypto-Jews. One of the key places they went to was Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, we get the growth of a large community of ex-crypto-Jews who go there to return to living openly as Jews. Another route for migration was to go to the Americas. And we have, and that continued well into the 16 and 1700s. We even have people coming into, some of the leaders that were coming into the American colonies, even into the 1700s, were crypto-Jews coming out of Portugal, coming to return to the open practice of Judaism. The people who were leaders in Newport, the Newport Jewish community, for example, had that background. Emma Lazarus' family apparently had that background. So we have this, and we'll see as we get on into next week, we talk more about the Americas and Mexico, that it was assumed that if a person had a Portuguese background, that they must be Jewish. So let's take a look at who some of these people were. And just a minute. Let's see, we're still in the screen share, I see. All right. Okay, this was something of the torture of the Inquisition, which you know about. And there were many, many different things they used. So are you seeing here Doña Gracia?
Yeah.
This is a rendering of Doña Gracia Nasi, who was a very wealthy woman in the 1500s, had been a Portuguese crypto-Jew. She left and eventually settled in the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul because the Muslims were accepting the Jews. She had been arrested by the Inquisition. In a dramatic measure, dramatic story. The Sultan, she was arrested by the Inquisition in Venice. The Sultan of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire, actually sent his ships to blockade Venice and to stop any commercial traffic until the Inquisition released Doña Gracia, which they did eventually. And she left and went to Turkey at that point. A dramatic figure who played a major role. She used her fleet of ships to facilitate thousands and apparently tens of thousands of people escaping Spain and Portugal to be able to go back to living openly as Jews in Salonika, in Rhodes, and they became that large Sephardic population that lived in that part of the world, the Balkans, and that part of the Ottoman Empire. And also in northern Israel, in Tiberias, was also a major settlement. Two of the people in Amsterdam who played major roles in this process are, on the left, Menashe ben Israel, who's known as the emancipator of the Jews, and negotiated with England to allow Jews to be readmitted there during the time of Cromwell. On the right is Isaac Aboab da Fonseca, who was the rabbi who built the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam. If any of you have been there, visited that synagogue, this is the rabbi who built that synagogue. Now, we will encounter him again in just a moment. But there's an interesting connection between these two. Both these are rabbis, and there's an interesting connection between them, which is this, a third person of crypto-Jewish background, Portuguese crypto-Jew who went to Amsterdam. This is Baruch Spinoza. Now, Baruch Spinoza had been a student of Menashe ben Israel, but when he came before the Beit Din and was asked to leave the congregation of the Portuguese synagogue, the rabbi leading that was Isaac Aboab de Fonseca. So his teacher on the left and the leader of the Beit Din on the right were the people who had so much influence on his life. And of course, Spinoza went on to be the Jewish leader of the Enlightenment, which was in the process of beginning. Another person that, back to Portugal, the royal astronomer of Portugal was Abraham Sacuto. And this part of the story is important because this begins to tell us how the Portuguese conversos, Portuguese crypto-Jews, arrived to the Americas. The Portuguese were leaders in navigation. Jews were very active in navigation, by the way. Jews were map makers. And like Abraham Sacuto, he was one that made all the astronomical tables that the voyagers used. Astronomical tables are critical for Judaism. You have to know when Shabbat is starting exactly and when Shabbat ends exactly. He made the calculations that were the best calculations that existed at the time. And Columbus used those astronomical tables on his voyage. Sacuto actually trained Vasco da Gama, who made the famous voyage to the east, to India. And Vasco da Gama used his tables also. Here's an example of his tables on the left. And on the right is the astrolabe, which Sacuto also improved to be able to make it workable for ocean-going travel. So Sacuto was is an example of the Jewish involvement in navigation at the time. The Jews, as I mentioned before, were navigators. They were the map makers. Sometimes they were the ship owners. They are common sailors. They were intricately involved. And as the Portuguese explored the the east coast of Africa, west coast, the Portuguese went down the coast around Morocco, down around the Guinea coast. They were setting up ports along there. And in the process, they discovered sugarcane, which they took to the Americas. And we began to get the shift then to the Americas going on here. You can see coming into various parts. The Portuguese would go particularly into Brazil, which is on the bottom right. The sugarcane became the largest trade item at the time. And Jews, Portuguese Jews, the Converso and Crypto Jews, had helped bring it from Africa to Brazil, and were very much involved as plantation owners, as middlemen. Amsterdam became the largest market in Europe for this. In response, the Dutch decided to invade Brazil and take over Recife, which was the capital of this sugar growing area, which they did in 1632. And this caused a crisis in the Spanish government then, which is called the Grand Conspiracy, because the Spanish then were convinced that the Dutch were aligning with the Jews to invade their colonies, their colonies and ports in the New World. So we have this, and the fact is, Recife, the Dutch was heavily, Amsterdam was heavily Jewish, had a large Portuguese Jewish population. Being Portuguese and speaking the language, they were very much involved in the occupation of Recife, which was Portuguese speaking. Recife very quickly became a majority Jewish city. It had about 3,000 inhabitants at the time. 2,000 were Jews. Some of them crypto Jews who, under the Dutch, actually came back to being able to practice Judaism. And synagogue was established, which is still there, by the way, the Synagogue Kahal Sur Israel. Now, this building had to be rebuilt about 100 years ago, but it's in the same place, same style as the old one. And by the way, Recife has a large fall Jewish festival every year where tens of thousands of people go to celebrate the Jewish heritage. So you have the situation that this was happening, but in the 1650s, the Portuguese came back and were able to defeat the Dutch and retake Recife. Now, this had a consequence which is interesting to us, because as the largely Jewish population of Recife was being sent back to Amsterdam, the boats came and took them back. One of the boats had a problem at sea. There are different stories about what happened, but it did not make it to Amsterdam. 23 of the people who were rescued from that ship actually went on another ship called Santa Catarina, which was going to New Amsterdam, or New York, as we can see here. Those 23 people arrived into New York in August of 1654, just before the high holidays. They celebrated the high holidays, and shortly after that, they established the first synagogue in the Americas, which is Sharif Israel, which still exists today at 70th on the west side of the Central Park. So we began to get the story of the people who, we began to see how conversos of Portuguese crypto-Jewish background become major figures in establishing what is the Jewish community in the Americas. And the next week we'll go on and see, now this has happened in the 1600s in what was to be became New York. In the same time period, there were crypto Jews coming into the American Southwest through the route from Mexico, and we will look at more of that next week. And I wanted to mention, if you want to do some further reading on this, the classic book that I mentioned before, The Jews of Spain, is written by Jane Gerber, which you'll see here on the left. And much of the information we're going in much more detail is also on my book, Crypto Jews, which you can see here on the right. So with that, let's go back to Matthew, and it's
Yes,
your turn.
hi. Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting lecture. And I can see a number of questions have come in, and I welcome everyone to continue to send questions with the Q&A button. And we'll ask the ones that we can get to. And we also have next week if we aren't able to get to all of them. So to begin with, there are a couple of questions asking for the continuation of some of the stories you told. One question is, what happened to Halevi's wife who refused to convert? And the other one is, what happened to the two Jewish advisors to the king and queen of Spain? I think Senor was that.
Okay, good. Thank you. Good question. Solomon Halevi's wife, as I mentioned, did not convert. We lose sight of her for a long period of time. But the interesting thing is, at the end of her life, she was buried in a cemetery of a church that her former husband, now the Archbishop of Burgos, had actually built. Now, so the question has always come up, why was she buried in a Christian cemetery when she refused to convert? I don't have the answer to that. I don't know exactly, unless there was some special arrangement made. As happened in some occasions in these places, there you can even see this in some parts of the United States, where Jewish burials will actually be to the side of a regular cemetery. I mean, set off to a separate. If there's not a unique Jewish cemetery itself, sometimes it will be a section off to the side of the regular cemetery. So my guess is she was probably buried in that kind of way, outside of the cemetery, but next to it. You know? And the two advisors, Isaac Abravanel and Alfonso Senior, have very different stories. Isaac Abravanel refused to convert. So when the deadline came in 1492, he left for Italy. And supposedly, according to the records, with 10,000 followers. It's very interesting that they could go to Italy, which you would think is the home of Catholicism, because it's where the Vatican is and all that. But interestingly enough, Jews were not expelled from Italy. And Jews were had an important presence there all through this period, that the terrible things were happening in Spain with the Spanish Inquisition. Now, Abraham Senor was a totally different case. Now, here were two men who were friends, both advisors of the Queen. Abraham Senor decided to convert and stay in Spain. His son-in-law, who was a rabbi, converted. So the entire extended family converted. The children, his wife, they converted and stayed. Now, I've often wondered what is going on when why did people choose to convert and stay? You know, as I mentioned before, you know, there are questions of wealth, there are questions of property, culture, tradition, whatever. But the other side of it is, many of these people had seen that Jews had been expelled in France on two different occasions. They were expelled in 1306 and then permitted back in 1315, 9 years later. Later in the 1300s, they were expelled again, and a decade or so later were invited to come back into Spain. My suspicion is that some of the people at that point thought, we will feign conversion, like Maimonides had said could be done, and wait out the expulsion decree, because I think they might have thought it's impossible that Spain expel everybody and leave it that way. I mean, they'll come to their senses, they'll reverse the edict of expulsion, and then we'll go on with our lives. We'll go back to being Jewish and so on. I don't know for sure because we don't have written records on this, but I wonder if this might not have been the thinking of some of those people who did convert and stay. And of course, the story, as we know, the edict of expulsion was never rescinded. It was finally rescinded in 1968, by the way, 1968. Now, Jews were living in Spain before they rescinded the edict of expulsion, but it stayed intact right up until just a few years ago. Another part of this, part of the same thinking, many of the people who left Spain at this point actually closed up their houses, locked the house, left without selling the house, and took the keys with them. Now, there's an important story that goes around of Sephardic families living in Italy, France, Morocco, who had actually carried the keys of their houses with them, with the idea that the edict would be rescinded and they could go home and reclaim their property. But again, of course, that never happened, and it became a kind of a mythical story of the keys of the family. So this is what we know about those two advisors that the question was on.
Thank you. And talking about property is reminiscent of a few other questions here, and about, I think you mentioned also in your talk about the synagogues becoming churches, and sort of like what happened to the synagogues. Somebody noted a couple in Toledo have
Right.
Christian names, and so are there other synagogues or any stories about that conversion or that you want to speak to?
Yes, there are former synagogues that are now churches in Segovia, Toledo, many other cities. And as I mentioned before, as we've traveled around Spain, whenever I would come to a town and find that the name of the church was Sangre de Cristo, I always began to wonder, was this a former synagogue that was taken in 1492? So all of the property, all the Jewish communal properties were confiscated by the crown at that point. The schools and the hospitals were simply taken by the crown and kept. The synagogues were turned over to the church. And we do have the famous examples in Toledo of the church that's called Santa Maria la Blanca, which is a former synagogue, which is still owned by the church. And the Jewish community has been asking for years for that building to be returned to the Jewish community. The church refuses to do it. There's another former synagogue which is called El Tránsito in Toledo, which actually now belongs to it's a state organization has it, and it's turned into a museum. So you have these examples. The one in Segovia is still the church, and I think most of the ones in Spain that were confiscated, if the buildings still exist, they're still in church hands.
Yeah, thank you. I'm surprised that there hasn't been more movement by the church to return the properties, given the world we're in today. But it's been a long time, so yeah. On another subject, there's a question about the lives of the household, how would people have kept kosher? Would they have been able to maintain that in the household? And were there secret kosher for this person says, for example, were there secret kosher butchers, or did the crypto Jews use Morisco halal butchers?
Two things happened, at least in some situation. When we talk about crypto Jews in Spain, then in Portugal, then in the Americas, what we're going to find is there are many different patterns. Not everything was exactly the same. Some of the things we'll see next week. Some of the most common practices were observing Shabbat, lighting candles on Friday night. There were others that were common, but there was on other things there was variation. Now, so one of the things in some places, at least early on, there must have been a kosher butcher still functioning in secret. Later on, what we find, and we find in the Americas, people are slaughtering animals in using kosher-like techniques. So again, it's not a rabbi, it's not a religiously authentic practice, but it's using kosher techniques to slaughter animals. And we find that in the Americas, being done by families. And sometimes they don't even realize, especially later on, as people still continue practices, but not realizing their origin. Sometimes people were doing these things, not realizing that they were using Jewish practices. I've even heard of one incident in Brazil where a family was slaughtering pigs using kosher-like techniques. So you find all kinds of mixtures going on.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting to see what unfolds over the centuries as far. There's a couple of questions here about Christopher Columbus and his Jewishness. Do you have any thoughts on that, or any explication of whether or not that is accurate, or whether or not there's anything there to that story?
Okay, what we know is that if Columbus was of Jewish descent, and there's some indication that he was very good at keeping it a secret. He was a crypto Jew, and like crypto Jews, he knew how to hide, because he would never have gotten the authorization from the Catholic King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella for the voyage to the Americas if they had any indication of his Jewish background. But that said, one of his prime supporters in court was Isaac Abravanel that we saw earlier. And Isaac Abravanel apparently was one of the ones who offered to help fund the voyage. Now, the king and queen authorized the voyage, but they didn't put up any money. Columbus had to come up with his own money. He actually got the ships in Palos, down on the coast, from a converso family. So he got the ships from a converso family. We know that Jewish people close to the court, and by the end they had to be conversos if they were still staying there, were helping fund the voyage. We also know that key figures in the voyage were conversos. The two surgeons on the trip, the bursar on the trip, and the translator were all converso background, Jewish background. In fact, one of the interesting stories that Luis Torres, who was the linguist, the translator on the trip, because he knew Hebrew, Arabic, Latin, he was multilingual. We know, in fact, that he literally converted just days before the trip because he wanted to go on the trip with Columbus. He was literally at the point of either keeping his Jewish identity and leaving Spain or converting, and he chose to convert so he could go on the trip with Columbus. And so it's very interesting. So Columbus has all these connections. Everyone around him is converso or Jewish. We also know that Columbus would make notes on the edge of some documents in Hebrew script. So you have all of these indications. I mean, he was intricately involved. He used Sakuto's astronomic tables. He used maps that were drawn up by a Jewish map maker. There is some indication that the background of his family might have been conversos from Spain. It can't be proven, but there's some indication of it. So for the question, was Columbus a Jew? He was very good at hiding his Jewishness. but he was surrounded by Jews. He functioned in the Jewish context, which certainly suggests that, that there's a very strong likelihood that was his background.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I never heard the story about the writing in Hebrew script. So that's, and during that, you mentioned sort of some of the economics related to Spain, and there's a couple of questions about whether or not there were economic repercussions to the expulsions and the Inquisition for the country, or.
Oh yes, oh yeah, there were serious economic repercussions, and one of the biggest ones was that Spain, by expelling the Jews, expelled its merchant class and the people who had in its financial class, and people who had experience in international commerce. Now, part of the reason this became important is because, as we know, 1492, Columbus found the Americas. And within a matter of, really within a matter of 30 years or so, the Americas rapidly were becoming a source of mineral wealth, of silver and gold, that were coming out of the Americas into the Spanish coffers. And especially as the 1500s went on, those shipments of gold and silver became larger and larger. Spain did not have the financial and the commercial class to handle this sudden great increase in wealth. Spain didn't have the infrastructure, like the business infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, or manufacturing, production infrastructure. So they were having to buy things in Europe with this wealth. So what happened was it caused an inflation rate that was apparently very strong and was harmful for the economy. The entire wealth of Europe increased rather dramatically in this process. And very quickly we get the rise of the mercantile age coming. But Spain, during the early 1500s, benefited from much of this. But by 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, as it was trying to invade England and overthrow the Protestant monarch there, that really came to be a turning point for Spain, and its economy really did not continue. Spain never developed an economic infrastructure after this, and much of the wealth went into other European countries, and Spain eventually became one of the poorer countries in that process. So talk about the economic impact. All of that process was caused because they expelled the financial and the merchant class, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a surprising story to me, but it's interesting how it all unfolded. There's also a few questions about the process of conversion, were the converts required to take classes? Was there education, or was it sort of, maybe it varied depending on the time, but sure.
So one of the striking things is, and one of the problems in Spain was, people were converted, but they were never given any orientation about what it was to be a Christian. The church didn't have any preparation for that. And so one of the problems that continued was, especially early on in the 1400s, when this was going on, people would convert, but they would continue living in their same community around their Jewish family. They would continue going to a Shabbat dinner, and in some cases observing Shabbat fairly openly. So this was one of the problems that led to the establishment of the Inquisition. So in a sense, rather than having an educational program and teaching converts how to be Christians, on the contrary, they established the Inquisition, which was to punish people for continuing their Jewish practices. But this was one of the major problems, that Jews continued within their families, and ultimately, part of the reasoning that was given for the expulsion was precisely that. They said we have to expel all of the practicing Jews because they're bad influences on the Jewish converts. Now, another thing that happened here, which is interesting, is that even after Jews converted, in the church and in Spain, people continued seeing them as Jews. And one of the arguments from some of the scholars is that the reason, the purpose of the Inquisition really was to eradicate the conversos, or the crypto-Jews, because they still saw them as being Jews, and they were trying to eradicate any Jewish presence, even if they'd converted. So there was this kind of this anti-Jewishness continued even after people had converted. You know, that was not enough to save them in many cases.
I'm wondering, was there a difference between sort of maybe the average person and the few stories of rabbis who, you know, went to study and then, you know, made their way up into the hierarchy? To me, like they clearly became more seen as, you know, clearly seen as Christian and into that world. Was there a difference between those? Like, what do you see that as?
Well, the thing is that if you converted, there were real advantages to converting, because in the 1400s, some of the rules have been established against Jews is doctors, pharmacists, craftspeople were, in the extreme cases, were not allowed to interact with the Jewish community. With the Christian community. So a Jewish doctor could not treat Christian patients. So essentially what this means is their potential clientele was reduced dramatically, which led to poverty in the Jewish community. Now, if you converted to be a Christian, then those rules were off. You might be Jewish in your background, but if you were a Christian, you could treat Christian patients. And suddenly you had a whole new professional life open up before you. If you were a Christian, you could hold public office. If you were a Christian, you could open businesses. So there were these very real advantages to people converting because they could begin to interact economically in a way that was not possible for Jews to interact. Another thing that happened here, which is very interesting, is that at this time, genealogies became very important because people actually carried booklets around. It's like a passport with your family tree in it. And of course, if you had any indication of having a Jewish background or being Jewish in your family tree, then you could be caught as being a converso, and then you could be denied certain jobs, certain honors. You could be denied from being able to intermarry with a Christian family, an old Christian family. So there was, in Seville particularly, there was a profession that developed. It was called the linajudo, which was like a genealogist. And their job was to produce these booklets of the genealogy. And with the right payment, they would fix your family tree for you so that you would not have any evidence of having a Jewish background or a Muslim background, because it was also a problem to be a Muslim. So I've always kind of thought of this as, you know, the linajudo was willing to prune your family tree to make sure you had the right credentials to look like an old Christian. To take this even further, they kept books. And in Aragon, there's a famous green book, which records all of the conversos trying to stop this process of conversos beginning to appear as old Christians and marrying into old Christian families. So there were all these controls and, in a sense, shenanigans going on, trying to deal with this issue of even after you were a Christian, you still had to deal with the fact that your family had been Jewish, and people found ways to try to get around that to be able to function fully in Spanish society, if that was their decision, to stay there. Now you see, because of all these problems, you can understand why increasingly people who didn't want to deal with all this simply left Spain and either went to the Ottoman Empire, went to Amsterdam, Morocco, where they could live openly as Jews again and just be done with it, So.
Yes, thank you. There's a large number of people have asked, and if you don't know the answer, you can let us know. But with Jews being involved in the sugar trade, were Jews also involved in the slave trade to the Americas?
Yes, they were, and we'll talk about that next week. Okay. I've been doing a lot of work in Cartagena. Cartagena was one of the largest slave trading ports in the Americas. Cartagena and Veracruz were major slave trading ports, and both had significant Jewish populations that were involved in the trade, were involved in the navigation and the shipping. So yes, that did exist.
Thank you. And I'll ask one more question, and then leave you for maybe your final thoughts for this evening. I'll combine a couple here. We talked about what happened to the synagogues a little bit. If you know anything that happened maybe to the cemeteries and maybe other sacred objects. And there's a question also, similar vein but different. How many Jews were actually murdered in the Inquisition itself, or was it more largely symbolic?
Okay. In terms of sacred objects, Torah scrolls largely were taken out of Spain. So as people were leaving, they took the Judaica with them. So that was gone. We've already discussed what happened to the synagogues. Schools and hospitals were taken over by the government, and so on. And I'm sorry, I'm missing the second part of the question. Could you please?
Oh yeah. How many Jews were actually murdered in the Inquisition itself?
Oh yes. Okay. We know we know of 2,000 who were burned at the stake. That was in Spain. The interesting thing is, in the Americas, the Inquisition was the population, the crypto-Jewish population in the Americas was much smaller to start with. So it was never as large as it was in Spain. And the putting people to death here happened in smaller numbers. We're talking about hundreds of people here. So, and the other thing about in Cartagena, for example, there were less than 5 cases, as I remember. There were very, very few cases in Cartagena. In the Americas, most of the cases were in Lima and in Mexico City. The other thing about the Inquisition that's important to note is, I mentioned that in Spain, by the end of the 1600s, the arrests for Judaizing had dropped down to very small numbers. And in the Americas, we again find a similar situation, that with the grand conspiracy that I had mentioned before, where the Spanish were afraid that the Dutch and the English were going to ally with the Jews and take over their their rich colonies. They launched the Inquisition against the Jewish community, and this was literally a political. The Inquisition was frequently used for political purposes. Remember, it's an instrument of the Spanish crown, so it wasn't always used strictly for religious purposes. Many times it was political, and we'll see that more next week also. In this reaction to the fear that the Jews were going to ally with the English and the Dutch, the Spanish crown launched the Inquisition against the Jewish community of Cartagena and Lima originally, and then later on in Mexico. And so it became a political process. Basically what they did was to decapitate the leadership of the crypto-Jewish communities. There were communities, there were known people. For example, in Cartagena, there was a regular minyan. With the church, the building still exists in Cartagena where the minyan met. We know where it is. So the Inquisition arrested the leaders, and in doing that, basically the idea was to cut off the leadership of the Jewish community. And it basically forced everybody else who remained to go underground. And the interesting thing today is that in all of the countries where there was a crypto-Jewish underground during the colonial period in the late 1600s, into the 1700s, it's in those same countries today that we have primarily the movement of the return to Jewish identity. Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, the American Southwest. It's very interesting, this correlation between where we know there have been crypto-Jewish populations and what's happening today in reclaiming Jewish identity. So, and we'll look at that a little bit next week. Also, we have letters that survived. Parents in Amsterdam pleading with their children, with their sons in Cartagena, for example, to leave because of the fear of the Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition lost authority and its fear factor with time. By the time we get into the early 1700s, the Spanish crown, the Habsburgs, have their last heir, the last Habsburg king. There was no heir. So the French Bourbon family line came in and took over the Spanish crown. Now, the Bourbons were much more liberal. They didn't like the Inquisition, and they essentially pulled the teeth of the Inquisition at that point in the early 1700s. But it continued to exist, and it exists as a fear factor. But what we'll see, and we'll see this next week, what happens is that the fear of coming out openly as Jewish, I mean, the Inquisition still existed. It still could arrest you. I don't know to what extent people realize that it didn't have the power that it had before, but people kept their secrets, and that has continued to be a form of behavior right into the modern era. So part of what I'm saying is the Inquisition was such a terrible institution early on in the 1600s. Its fear factor continued well after it had the power. Now, it still existed. Spanish Inquisition existed up until 1832, when the acting regent finally abolished it. But toward the end, it did not have the power that it had in the beginning.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't realize that the Inquisition lasted so long there. We're about out of time now. Do you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with, or do you think that's a good note for us to end on?
Okay, I look forward to picking up the story next week and looking in some more details about individuals, families that lived through this. and talking about, in a sense, I'm not sure we can talk about a crypto-Jewish culture, but there were patterns of practices that became established in the converso crypto-Jewish world, and we'll be looking at that next week and looking at has been going on in recent years with the development of this movement of Jewish return, which has been incredible. And I think you'll find that interesting as we go into that part of the story. So I look forward to seeing you next week.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you again, Dr. Hart. We look forward to learning with you next week, and there's so much more to explore on this journey together. And for all of you out there who ask questions, we'll forward your questions along this week, and so that Dr. Hart can read through some of them. We didn't get a chance to go through all of them, but thank you again, and thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you all next week at 7:30 Eastern time. See you then.
Great. See you then.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.